And so I want to just introduce the panelists before we get started. To my left, go ahead, have a seat. To my left is Andres Duany, who that was a beautiful speech, Andres. I learned so much from that. Andres is an architect, urban designer, planner, and author, and has dedicated over 3 decades to pioneering and implementing a vision for sustainable urban development. He and his wife, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg, are principals of the Miami-based firm of Duany Plater-Zyberg. Andres and DPZ have influenced planners worldwide. They've produced plans for hundreds of new and renewed communities, including 2 that other people on this panel have a lot to do with, and that you'll see in the excerpt of our film that we'll show in a few minutes, Seaside and Alice Beach on the panhandle of Florida. Andres is the author of many essays and articles and the co-author of several books, and among his awards, he and Elizabeth are Driehaus Prize laureates themselves. And Andres is also, in April, one of the stars of our national PBS primetime special, primetime series, an episode of that, 10 Homes That Changed America. 10 towns, sorry. Andres is in 10 towns that changed America because Seaside is one of those towns. And that'll be on April 14th, nationwide on PBS, so set your DVRs. To Andres's left is Paul Goldberger, who the Huffington Post has called the leading figure in architectural criticism. He is now the contributing editor at Vanity Fair. He also served as architecture critic for The New Yorker. He holds the Joseph Urban Chair in Design and Architecture at the New School in New York City, and formerly the Dean of the Parsons School. He began his career at the New York Times in 1984, and he won a Pulitzer for architectural criticism, one of just dozens of awards he's won over his long career. He's the author of numerous acclaimed books, most recently a major biography on Frank Gehry that has gotten wide acclaim, despite the fact that Frank Gehry will never, ever win a Driehaus Prize, I don't think. Paul lectures widely and appears regularly on television, and Paul is also one of the stars of actually 2 episodes of our PBS series. He's in the episode on 10 Homes That Changed America and 10 Towns That Changed America. Marieanne Khoury-Vogt and her husband and business partner, Aric Vogt, are the town architects of Alice Beach, which is a waterfront community a few miles from Seaside, where Scott Merrill was the town architect many years ago. And like Scott, Marieanne and her firm were recruited by DPZ, who planned both towns. They founded their firm, Khoury and Vogt Architects, in Miami in 2001. Prior to coming to Alice Beach, they'd done projects in Florida, New Jersey, Connecticut, Alabama, charrettes in Europe and Asia. Marieanne studied her undergraduate degree in Paris and obtained a double master's in architecture and urban planning from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And Aric and her husband and 2 kids were the first full-time residents of Alice Beach, where they still live. Aric Lasher is the design director of HBRA Architects in Chicago, where he began working in 1985, and the principal of HBRA, Thomas Beebe, is another Driehaus laureate. In addition to his architecture degree from Cornell, he has a film degree from USC, and he took time away from his career at HBRA to design sets for major motion pictures. Maybe you've heard of The Minority Report, Pearl Harbor, and What Dreams May Come. And after he got Hollywood out of his system, he returned to HBRA in 2005, was made a principal in 2006. And finally, all the way on the left, our left, your right, Scott Merrill is the winner of the 2016 Driehaus Prize, and as such, he is the main event today, although he will not appreciate my having said so. Having gotten to know Scott over the last few months while we were making a film about him, you know, every year we make a film about the Driehaus Prize winner, beginning with Bob Stern. This is our 6th film. And having gotten to know Scott in the process of making that film, I can say that he is quite modest, just like the vernacular structures that he so admires and which inspire his work. You've already heard a little bit. You'll hear a lot more about his career later, so I won't go into those details. Just a few brief insights that you probably won't hear from others. First of all, this born and raised Midwesterner never dreamed he would live in Florida, which is where he's lived for many, many years. But that's where the opportunity was, at Seaside and later at Windsor. Yes, he has fancy formal training from Yale, but his early inspirations were, when he was a kid in the suburbs of Cincinnati. Nearby is Glendale, one of America's first planned suburbs, and Green Hills, and he saw those places. And as we heard from Dean Likutis, he had his his, what he calls his Jack Kerouac years after college, road trips in a beat-up Datsun 510 that left a trail of blue smoke in its wake, hitchhiking, and even hopping a freight train. On the road, he learned to love America and its indigenous architecture. He and his wife, Zoanne, are the parents of two amazingly mature and articulate children, Will and Ella. Let's welcome our panel. So, Scott, I'll start with a question for you. In the opening scene of this film that we made, we actually reenact a little mini on-the-road road trip. You don't take me out in the Datsun 510. We go out in your much nicer Volvo, actually. But you take me out on the old Dixie Highway, past a bunch of sort of crumbling buildings, and you stop at this one place and you show me this crazy building that could only be in that place, which is this grapefruit sorter. It's kind of a contraption. As we see later in the film, your lovely chapel at Seaside, which I hope many of you are aware of, uses the same complex arrangements of vertical and horizontal elements to beautiful effect. Now, you are well-versed in the classical orders and historical precedents for houses of worship, but instead you chose to use this contraption as your inspiration for that chapel. And I think that embodies the theme that Dean Loukoutis has set out for the discussion, which is what we might call new uses for historical precedents, or maybe even new historical precedents. What criteria do you use? And maybe others can weigh in after we hear from you too. What criteria do you use to select precedents for your work?
Andreas's reaction to the film, I think, was that I looked like a chicken farmer in picking some of these precedents. So I appreciate that perspective as well. He said of the church, it's a sacred space, right? So I often don't describe it that way. I've invoked Inigo Jones, who describes having built St. Paul's Covent Garden as a barn, the most beautiful barn in the world. And of course, whether that's true or not, it's a helpful phrase, because sometimes economy is necessary, and sometimes your precedents have to be a little bit more modest. In terms of the grapefruit sorter and the chapel, admittedly, it's a bit of a stretch, but there's certain things about vernacular stuff that's incredibly rational. In the case of the grapefruit sorter, there happens to be this lateral load from the fruit that's being contained in it. And in the chapel, there's the lateral loading of wind in a hurricane zone. And so some of the bracing of the wall and the side walls of the chapel have the same patterns. It's not that it was necessarily a precedent, it's just that it's a rational response. And the patterns that you see in the hierarchies you see have everything to do with, say, contributing areas and things like that. And so vernacular architecture tends to be rational. People arrive all across the world. It's very similar solutions to very practical problems. And it's appealing to me, I guess, at that level.
So that's where you tend to go, is with these simpler, humbler, more rational solutions.
Well, look, if you want to make cities and not just buildings, you're going to have to do humble buildings as well, and you're going to have to push down as far and as low into the market as you possibly can. I don't know how else we're going to build cities if we don't find more modest precedents.
Paul, so we've been asked to kick around this idea of sometimes it's framed as modernity versus, tradition. As Dean Loukoutis said, there's sometimes framed as opposites. So you've just come out with your book on Frank Gehry, and you're also part of the Driehaus jury, right. So you seem to be ideally positioned to weigh in on this. Is Frank and the architects of his ilk at one end and the traditionalists completely at the other end? Is there never a middle ground, and never the twain shall meet?
I think the twain can and should meet often. In fact, I think Dean Loukoutis put it very well when he showed how Scott Merrill's work is one of the places in which it does meet. Sure, there are some people at opposite ends, but in fact, they're often the least interesting and least meaningful ones today. When I was researching the book on Frank Gehry, one of the things that moved me most was learning about how important going to Europe had been to him, discovering particularly Romanesque cathedrals, which gave him the sense of great, powerful form and weight combined with lightness and grace. And he'd never understood that before. And he just chose to interpret it in his own way that superficially may seem to break from precedent, but in fact is sort of intellectually and emotionally anchored in precedent more than it might appear to be visually. And I think that's one of the reasons that the best modern architects do not deny history and do not deny present. The bad ones do, but the bad architects of every period have done dumb things. And so, I mean, I think that the tragedy of modernism, and Scott alluded to it a moment ago, I think is in its inability to make humble buildings very well, and inability to make an urbanism. It makes great buildings quite wonderfully, but does not make an urbanism, and that's why we need to return to tradition for urbanism, because modernism offers no solutions to it.
That leads me right into a question that I had for Marieanne, which you are the town architect of Alice Beach, which DPZ did the plan for, and we've had the good fortune to visit a couple of times with our film crews. And you know, this is something I pulled from the material on Alice Beach. It says it has its roots in the style of Bermuda architecture and in the courtyards of Antigua, Guatemala, the colonial capital of America. The town plan, when you visit there, if you've not been there, it's in your face. You know, there is a strict continuity in the building styles, and of course it's walkable, it's dense, and it's communal. What do you feel about what Paul just said? Do the values of urbanism are they inherently more suited to traditional architecture?
I mean, Alice is in some ways really well positioned to answer this question, because the principles that guided the development, aesthetic as well as the principles of town making, I think are very much rooted in traditional architecture. But the precedents that DPZ looked to, meaning the typology of the type, which was the courtyard house, and then looking at the architecture, which was inspired originally from Bermuda, kind of presented an opportunity where we had to marry the two, I suppose, look at ways of expressing an overall streetscape that had to be coherent and that had to be rationalized and that had to be elegant and that also had to be a little bit understated. And so I think you'll see in the work of a lot of the different architects who have worked at Alice a little bit of both, where you clearly see that there is a look at precedent, looking back at precedents and tradition in terms of understanding the typology and understanding what we're trying to do, and then looking at ways of being a little bit inventive with the materials, looking at ways of working with the climate that's there, and allowing light and breezes and the like to permeate the public and the private realm.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on Bermudian architecture, but Andres walks very fast. You walked us all around that town. You were very enthusiastic. And I was struck by, there is a kind of a modern sort of feeling in the forms there. It's all white. A lot of these sort of ziggurat shapes and smooth surfaces, but there's a kind of a modern feeling to it too. Would you agree?
Well, one of the things about urbanism that makes it different from architecture, architecture can be very complex and very large. Urbanism has the element of time. You have a lot longer. And the way we use time is by downloading decisions to others sequentially. You know, we could do the buildings, but it's more interesting if we have dozens and then hundreds of architects do the buildings sequentially so that they affect each other. And they take unexpected turns.
Is some of it unexpected to you, what the town is looking like now?
Yes, quite, because it's not Bermuda.
Because it's not Bermuda. So in your head, you saw Bermuda.
What happened was that the craftsmanship of stucco and the forming of stucco actually achieved an extraordinary degree of sophistication, and the town architects noticed and actually developed a language actually quite affected by Islam, actually, that in which the shaving and the coving You know, all the shapes that only stucco can do and wood can't do and stone can't do, actually they did. And that would never have happened if we hadn't handed over. And so when we think about the vernacular, I think it's quite wrong to think of the vernacular as a style in the way that, you know, it's Bermuda. It's really a process of thinking. It's the vernacular mind. And by the way, my brother Douglas, who is a professor at Notre Dame, introduced me to the concept of the vernacular mind. And he said, we must rediscover the vernacular mind, not the vernacular styles. And it's a way of thinking. And the vernacular is a group effort of people converging. Rather than the individual modernist artist, you basically converge towards a shared goal. You're in agreement, and you set up an ethos in which an architect can learn from each other. Instead of what normally happens in a modernist school, if somebody gets a good critique, it's the one thing you can't do. And this is, we've reversed that at Seaside and in all these towns. If somebody has a success, you can do it. In fact, it's stupid not to. And that is the vernacular process. So it's fundamentally different than the process of modernism, which is one of invention.
I remember Vincent Scully's great observation that architecture is how the generations communicate to one another across time.
Across time. You can accelerate the generation simply by having the building sequentially, which you can't do. By the way, you might take a project that takes a very long time to build, but if it's designed all at once in a single design campaign, it doesn't have the vernacular mind. You really have to downstream to others sequentially. And urbanism is the managing of that, and people like Marieanne and Aric and Scott completely picked up in unexpected and entirely positive ways, and then handed over to the other. Like, you know, Alice would not have been what Alice is had Scott not done the town hall at Rosemary 10 years earlier. They just decant to each other, and the craftsmen decant to each other as well.
Yes, we heard actually when we were in Seaside, Robert Davis was telling us sort of the evolution of the craftspeople at coming to Seaside. Aric, I want to make sure that we all get part of this conversation. It's a lot of us here on stage. We can never really stop inventing, right? I mean, it's very interesting because in the material that I received prior to this, there's this term invention that gets used a lot, which I think is kind of code for going crazy sometimes, or doing things like out of your mind instead of based on precedent, right? So where's the balance between invention and going back to precedent? I mean, everything was invented at some point.
Maybe it has something more to do with synthesis and reconciliation. I mean, there are languages and conventions of architecture and composition and design that have been around for a long time that are still fertile and useful, but there are also contemporary ways of building, and buildings have viscera, which they didn't have in the past. And there are modern conventions and also expectations for how buildings might appear or how they're to be used that can provide an opportunity for synthesis with pre-existing languages that, like all human languages, might be arbitrary, but they carry considerable weight and power to communicate across time.
When you were designing in Hollywood, did you have more? Did you get to exercise more invention?
In a superficial way. Designing sets is entirely disengaged from the source of so much great architecture, which is the programmatic requirements and reconciling those with how buildings are actually built, the relationship between structure and enclosure. All of these things produce architecture, are the reason why architecture over time comes to look the way that it looks. And sets are entirely disengaged from that. But it is still a very interesting laboratory because what it forces you to embrace without prejudice is the purely representational aspects of architecture that the idealism of early modernism and this interest in disengagement from time and purism denuded architecture of. So you look at architecture entirely as a vehicle for meaning based on its superficial aspects, to convey character or identity. It's actually a very useful background to have if you're designing for institutions that have a long history, which are tied inextricably to certain ways that buildings look. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, what's particularly noteworthy, or what I noted in there, was that you're sort of disconnected from any of the sort of troublesome aspects of practicality, and that actually comes back to what you said at the beginning, Scott, about vernacular having solved a lot of these problems that are inherent to the locality where they're built.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the hard sell of vernacular architecture is that you're really sort of on the edge of the process. You're not central to it. And so the role that you play is a little bit less glamorous. And I think that may have something to do with the fact that it's not broadly appealing to our profession.
So 2 comments here. Yes, go ahead.
I think it's very important to keep in mind the distinction between invention and novelty, too. I think novelty is usually superficial. Invention can be much more profound. And I think all good architecture is inventive to some extent. I mean, I think every Driehaus Prize winner is an inventive architect, even if he or she does not like to go by that moniker. I mean, we build in the real world today, and that requires invention. No matter how much you rely on precedent, you are also inventing in a new way. And I think all great architecture, in fact, weaves together precedent for new things. I think Scott is being disingenuously modest in talking so much about the vernacular, because there's a difference between what he could do with the vernacular and what someone else will do. I mean, someone bringing poetry out of the vernacular is really the great achievement, I think. And that's what good architecture does.
Andres, you had a thought you wanted to throw in?
Well, I was going to make this, what you said about sets, that they have so much to offer except without the discipline of program and tectonics. I would posit that resorts, where so many of these buildings happen, actually are almost the perfect test beds for this kind of thing, because when you have 2 weeks vacation, you want to experience utopia. You don't leave New Jersey to arrive in New Jersey. Okay, you want to have a better experience, and so all these fantastic buildings that were done at Seaside and at Rosemary actually could not have been done in a full-time community. People don't take the risks. You can't propose, let's live in a courtyard house, you know, which is only 30 feet wide. You can't propose, let's put the car over there. You know, you can't propose, let's make a place that you can only walk to. But Americans are willing, in the circumscription of a resort experience, to try anything. And so I think they're actually, people dismiss them and say they're only resort towns. I say, no, they're actually the experimental test beds. And not only are they experimental for critics, people actually inhabit urbanism for a week. It's not just visiting and seeing, oh, that looks cool, but wow, what's it like to be a kid here? What's it like to wake up in the morning and find a coffee in the New York Times and a martini at midnight, walking? You know, what's it like? What's it like? And then when they experience it, and so even when Seaside has a very low habitation rate of full-time families, that's all for the good, because it means that more and more people experience it and take it home. And that's why these resorts are which are so technically unimportant in the minds of the, let's say, the intellectuals, are actually so effective. They're just propaganda for architectural experiment inhabited. And so you all were able to do amazing things in these places that you couldn't have done back in New Jersey, where we also all work. But you know what I mean.
You brought the Courtyard House back to Florida real estate, and it hadn't existed before Vero Beach.
Yeah, you bring the courtyard back, you bring the porch back, you bring all of these radical things. We brought this symmetrical pitch roof back. Whoa, that was amazing.
Well, Scott, you say in the film that the, you know, Windsor, which is a resort community, it's a sort of golf and horsey kind of resort community near Vero Beach, where Scott lives. In fact, it's what brought you to that area. You know, it's a little unreal in its, you know, in its use. It's a resort community, but you say in the film that it'll be really the true effect will be if this disseminates out into the wider world. Can it? Because there's another thing we actually never got to it in the film, but there's there's a shopping center that you've written about in Vero Beach called, of all things, Miracle Mile. And it's the same footprint as an entire town. And you have an idea about how, instead of a shopping center with an ocean of parking around it, it could be a vital place. But it's really challenging to do that in America, isn't it?
Well, I think what's interesting is I get a lot of opportunities to think at a larger scale because of Liz and Andres. One of the things I'm grateful to them for. And we have this Miracle Mile in our hometown, which must astonish people, you know, that we make such a big deal out of it. It's exactly the same size as these super blocks that we had a chance to work on in LA. And each
Alain is in the Middle East.
The UAE, right? And so Liz and Andres were hired to master plan the city of Alain, which was just built, what, 50 years ago or so. But the problems that we have in our own hometown are just remarkably similar to what we had to deal with in Alain.
Getting people to come back into the city.
Well, Alain actually subsidized villas and birthright lots and land on the edges of the city. And so they hired DPZ to help lure Emirati citizens back to the center. And of course, the very policies that lured them to the edge in the first place were not going to go away. It was almost as if it was you know, policies that were in total conflict.
And you find the same kind of limits in Vero with zoning that encourages exactly the wrong kind of development.
Right, so when we moved there 25 years ago, you could still smell orange blossoms in the springtime. And now they're so far pushed out from the center of the city that you can't smell them anymore because all the growth has taken place on the edges of a town that is very fond of its low density, low heights, low coverages, which have all been written into the zoning codes. And what I thought was interesting about working in LA is it seems exotic on one level, and it seems like it's dangerously close to home on another level.
Yeah, so is it, I mean, we're up against some real obstacles in this country to what it is that you're trying to do with these resort communities. Would you find that to be true? You've worked in Miami and other places, Marieanne?
Yeah, I mean, Alice Beach, we've been in a little bubble for a very long time, obviously, as anybody will tell you. But nonetheless, it is interesting to see the appeal for people who live in great large cities in the US, be it Atlanta or Birmingham or Nashville, and they come specifically to a place like Seaside or Rosemary or Alice because they want to feel transported. They want to feel like they're experiencing something completely different. They're still, I think, inherently tied to issues of, I mean, they're tied to issues of aesthetics and civic living, and I think they embrace the idea of being able to participate in the life of a town if they want to. But if they want to retreat and want to be a little bit more private, they can do that. But they generally are lured to places like this because of the sense of community and the sense of, as Andres was saying, being able to walk and eat and shop all within distance. And they're accepting in the architecture of some compromises that they maybe wouldn't otherwise immediately agree to.
So believe it or not, we have 1 minute left in our conversation. It's gone by very quickly. I don't want to just go down the line. Does anybody want to weigh in with some final words about this premise that, I mean, clearly we don't feel that, you know, tradition's on one side and modernity is on the other side, but that there's a synthesis, and maybe this is something new.
Well, I'd like to say, because schools are so central to the problem that we have, you know, theoretically, we shouldn't have to code anything. You know, the architects who graduate should be able to look left, look right, see where the front is, and actually respond contextually and with the intention of they would be able to read it. But the schools so distort the student, who, by the way, is a perfectly normal person, with a vernacular mind when they show up.
A normal person when they come in.
When they come in, yes. They come in, and then within very quickly, in something that's similar to basic training in the Marine Corps, they blow out their brains and they refill it. And then we have this problem of actually people that actually don't know how to behave urbanistically or even coherently. And I think that the real challenge is I would give it to the schools, because I don't want to code. I just want to be able to do like the 1920s town planners, go to it. you know? And I think that the idea of the vernacular mind, which is a way of thinking, is something that if it could be nurtured instead of eradicated. Because one of the things that I think has happened to many of the people here is that they've had to recover from their architectural education. I don't know how many say, I've had to recover from what I was taught. You had to, and it's very hard to recover that mind. It's actually longer, it takes longer to recover it than to acquire, you know, the academic mind. And perhaps schools could have a way of getting through in which the nature of the human that you're working with is nurtured. Now, some want to be like Frank Gehry, and there should be a silo for them as well. But to think that people graduate from schools and have never seen any single building in an art history course that wasn't done by a genius, you know, it's astounding when actually they should, I'd like to see a course in which no building is done by a genius. That no author is known. These are the buildings of the world. Look how pleasant they are. You know, that would be amazing.
In a way, one might say that the burden of proof should be on why should it be different, rather than the burden of proof be on why should it be the same.
Right.
Actually,
reverse that.
It should be reversed.
Right.
In a way.
A kind of skepticism.
Yeah. Prove why it should be different.
Right.
And there are moments when, in fact, it should be different.
Right.
But they're few and far between.
Right.
That's the point, I think.
Very good. Scott, I'll give you the final word. You looked like you were leaning forward there.
He had to recover from his education.
Excuse me. You know, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the questions that we've been discussing today, and I have my problems with the frame a little bit. If you are a young architect and you ask what your times demand of you, there's a lot of different conclusions that you can reach by looking at the very same evidence. I mean, we look at the landscape in front of us, you know, the human landscape and the physical landscape. And we all, I think all people of good faith probably ask themselves, what's demanded of me? And we come to such different conclusions because we see such different things in the very same evidence. And whatever large force it is that we're considering, let's say the market, some of us see the dynamism in it, and some of us see the fuel for innovation. And others of us see something that sinks to the lowest common denominator all too often, or even tenements which are rational but cruel. And I think it's reasonable, instead of talking about modern and traditional architecture so much, I think maybe more time should be spent trying to give relative weight to what we observe. And the thing is that traditional architecture, I think, gives more relative weight to the things that seem more intractable. And that's, I think, most of us in this room are probably vitally interested in things that are intractable problems, things that change less, things that are harder to solve.
Very good. Very good. Let's give our panel